I'm going to talk about rye, but I'm going to talk about a bunch of other things too, actually, that I think are important to talk about. So yeah, I guess I am kind of the rye guy. I got tied into that a few years ago when Rob Graff nominated me to be the rye coordinator for the co-op trial, so it all kind of started there, so thanks for that, Rob. And actually it's been interesting, it's been a fun time because obviously the hybrids were coming onto the market, so supervising that trial and making it go kind of got us to the point where that stuff was then released and then taken up by seed companies like SeedNet and then also FP Genetics. The rye is a fascinating beast. The more I get into it, the more questions I have actually. But hybrids from compared to OPs, I mean, a lot of that information is out there. There's a clear yield advantage. The grain quality aspects are better. So there are some really good aspects. I'm not knocking OP. I'm working in that. I'm doing breeding in that. Certainly, I'm trying to improve some of those traits, but I'm starting to work on a few other things to try to facilitate some other systems. So that includes rye, because it is quite early in terms of heading out and stuff like that, to try to use it from a biomass perspective. So for cattle guys, you want to silage it off or try to do some double cropping. I'm working on some of that. So that's kind of that. The agronomy, we're doing some of that. We have a trial out that's kind of finishing up this year, but it was really kind of a show and tell to try to look at rye from a conventional, so lower input perspective, which is kind of traditionally how people have grown it, versus a more intensive management system. We learned some interesting things, so just some take home from that. Really, the heterosis in hybrid rye, so that's really the difference from the OP, really comes to the size of the head. So it's about 9 kernels more on average. That's what it was last year, so that's kind of one thing, and it's important. Then when you think about agronomy and stuff, that you protect that head, that's important. Obviously you're going to do that anyways, but just something really to consider. The other interesting thing actually is last year was challenging for some of the people that were involved in this trial. It was dry and then it got wet, and what we found actually in the higher input systems, so the intensive management, is that the rye tended to produce a lot of kind of extra or late tillers, and that led actually to ergot production. So there's some agronomy work that really needs to be done in rye in terms of kind of managing the crop properly with the amount of nitrogen. Because this stuff yields, I think people will really kind of be keen on really trying to push that, but there's kind of a fine line. So some of that work is now being done by people in Saskatchewan. That data will be coming out and people can see it. So yeah, I'm assuming this is this Catino?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So it is. Well done, Greg. Yeah, so you can see, the interesting thing is people assume that actually rye is quite a bit earlier than winter wheat. If you look at this, I would say that's not necessarily the case. This is under irrigation, so keep that in mind. But actually rye does head out early, but when you look at it, it actually undergoes anthesis or flowers very similar to winter wheat. And actually when you look at the data, certainly from southern Alberta, it flip-flops which is earlier, kind of winter wheat or rye from a maturity perspective. So just so you're aware of that. That's one neat thing about the crop. Any other questions about rye? I'm going to move on to some other things. I've kind of beat that horse to death. I've talked at Farming Smarter several times, and so. But anyways, that's me. You can find me on Twitter. I talk about it a fair bit. We have some good conversations. That's a good place to start, certainly. And there's lots of good rye growers out there that are on Twitter. You can talk to them too as well. I encourage you to do that. The one other thing so I'm doing a couple other things. I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I was actually hired as a perennial cereals breeder, so I'm actively breeding perennial cereal rye and actually perennial wheat. So that's funded by Ag Canada for the most part, as well as Alberta Wheat. So thank you very much, and props to Ag Canada, right, George? Okay, so some of the things we're doing at perennial wheat. The one thing through our kind of internal Ag Canada funding is we're actually going after the genes that are responsible for perennial growth habit. That's a pretty major thing. Nobody's really cracked that nut yet in any crop or any plant type, and so we're trying to figure that out. We hope that will actually give us a lot of room to kind of grow from a perennial wheat perspective. There's lots of new kind of options that we can kind of use to try to get that. The idea would be that we would find those genes are, and then we could actually kind of change them in Rob's winter wheat, and we'd have something that is really stable, high quality perennial wheat. So that's something to look at. I guess the other thing, and it was really interesting, listening to the sustainability talk. So 2 weeks ago I was in Kansas. That was at a meeting sponsored by the Land Institute. If you're familiar with them, they are people that work in perennial, basically domesticating perennial crops so that we can grow them as an oil seed or as a grain. This one was particularly focused on kernza. So kernza is intermediate wheatgrass that they're domesticating. And it was a fascinating meeting on a lot of levels. Their breeding approaches are very, very advanced, so they're doing really a lot of things with genomic selection and sequencing, so it's quite impressive. They are doing a lot of things on the agronomy perspective that lags really far behind. I think there's a lot of things actually that from a Western Canadian perspective that I know that we could use, that we can improve the system from that perspective. That's really critical. The other interesting thing, of course, perennial, this kernza, is interesting. It doesn't yield a lot, okay? It yields about 10 bushels to an acre. But the fascinating thing is that people at that meeting, it was a small group, it was General Mills, it was Patagonia. There are a lot of actually people with a lot of horsepower that are very interested in this crop or in perennial grains from a sustainability perspective. Okay, so Patagonia, they're taking the grain and they brewed a beer now with it, so you're going to be able to find that if you go into the U.S. and you go along the West Coast, you'll be able to find it there. I think it's called Long Root Ale, I think, or something. And so Patagonia is the clothing people, okay? They have a sustainability thing, just so you're curious. But yeah, General Mills was there. They're very keen on this. The key is that they can get enough of it. That's the real thing. At 10 bushels an acre, there's a long ways to go. But I will say this, I know we won't get a chance to see this, but it's very impressive what they've done so far domesticating intermediate wheatgrass. So they now have, it doesn't like lodge and fall all over the place. You see these really tight, erect plants. It's a really interesting study on domestication. So what we've done in wheat over kind of 12,000 years, they've done basically in 16 years. So it's pretty neat. And they have pictures, of the roots being, 3, 4, 5 meters long, and this stuff going way down. So you think then from a sustainability perspective, that's a lot of carbon going into the ground. That's accessing moisture lower. That's going to get nutrients that may have leached lower in the soil and making use of some of that. There's some pretty, when you start to think about perennials and stuff, there's some pretty interesting angles. Some people, I've talked to some researchers, they think it's kind of a really disruptive technology. So like no-till, going to that, finding something that's productive enough, but going to something like that, if you think about seeding every 3 years, there's some reduced costs, reduced disruption, various things like that. It could be quite interesting. So that's the perennial wheat side. Anybody have any questions for that? No. Okay, so the next thing, yes, so I am working on winter triticale. That's an interesting one. I'm working on it from a bread making perspective as well as from a forage biomass perspective. What you see or what you're familiar with in terms of triticale now will look nothing like that in 10 years, I guarantee you. Rob started some of this work, and so we've kind of worked together on this. But the reason why he picked it up is I think he saw these triticales and his mind was blown. I looked at them, I was like, holy smokes, we need to do something about this. I initially thought to get the height, or to get the biomass, for triticale, which is where that crop is going, we had to have something tall. And last year I had trials, and that is absolutely not the case. So there's material that will yield, Rob, 50% more than winter wheat. The only thing that can't beat it is hybrid, or that it can't beat is hybrid rye. But there are some really kind of neat aspects of that. Finally, I guess the last thing I'll touch on is I'm also doing some winter durum wheat breeding. Okay, so durum wheat obviously is a pretty important crop, especially in southern Alberta. The nice thing is that those growing regions overlap. People that grow durum typically know how to grow winter cereals as well. We're working on that. Last year we had a trial out in the field, and we've got it out again this year. Some of those lines out-yielded winter wheat, and Rob, but there were a lot that did not. And I have to say, so that's quite interesting. The plant type is pleasing. It's very easy to kind of see that there are some applications for this. There are some challenges. First is cold tolerance. At Lethbridge it did great. At Vauxhall it did not do that well. It was winter killed. We think we can work on that. Using Rob's material to cross with, we're going to start doing some of that work. And then also the grain quality perspective, it's really variable, and so that's one thing that we need to kind of work on. We've been making crosses with some of the spring Durhams from Swift Current and other places to try to bring in the quality as well as some of the agronomic traits and various other things. So that's kind of where that is at. So it's really kind of evaluation. We're getting material from all over the place. I planted the gene bank out. If you want to see a rat's nest and a real mess, do that sometime. There's 1,000 lines out in the field. They were all over the place, lodged. Some of them had fuzzy gloom, some of them had no awns. It was really fascinating. From a breeding perspective, you get kind of interested and kind of geek out on some of that stuff. But anyways, that's kind of, I guess, the summary for my stuff. I don't know. We probably won't go by my plots. If you guys are around after the tour today and want to see some of that stuff, I'd be happy to show you, well, really anything. Any of the rye, triticale, the wheat, as well as the perennial wheat and perennial cereal rye that I've got across the field. Or if you're ever through Lethbridge at all, probably, well, I guess within the next 2 weeks, you can kind of get a hold of me, and I'm happy to take you through. 2 weeks from now, I think we expect to have pretty much everything off, so that time is coming. So other than that, that's it for me. Thanks.